Anyway, tonight we're very lucky to have him speaking to us on Ottoman Aleppo through British eyes.
Thank you, Philip. I'd also like to thank Quentin for approving of my appearance, and for Philip for the invitation, and for Craig for all of his assistance at various stages in what's going on. Now, if this works, first of all, just a few images that will represent some of the chaps I'll be talking about, although we don't really know who they are. There was an Italian, a Florentine artist called Andrea Soldi, who was active throughout the 18th century, who made his career doing portraits of the British Levantine merchants, both in Aleppo and in Constantinople, and he then came to London, made a fortune, spent it all on various things. That's about all I can tell you about him. Craig has kindly put these images up on the Levantine Heritage website. I know nothing about them, other than that they were by him, or they're attributed to him, and they appear to represent, in most cases, English merchants of the period from which, now this one there's been some doubt whether it's really him or not, and I'll leave that up for the moment for reasons that may or may not become clear. Now, can you hear me at the back? Well enough? Yes? So if I can keep this pitch up, I'll not use the mic, but I'll get the mic going if necessary. What is Aleppo? Back in 2016, on Thursday, the 8th of September, during a live interview on early morning television, US presidential candidate Gary Johnson was asked, what would you do if you were elected, about Aleppo? Poor Gary, his response, what is Aleppo? His response rapidly hashtagged its way across the Twitter sphere, while the YouTube clip, which you can still get, of the incident reached close on 1 million viewers by the end of the year. What was less well noted, but perhaps even more alarming, was how the New York Times was swiftly obliged to publish corrections to its own report of Johnson's howler, which claimed, the New York Times this is, that Aleppo was not only the capital of Syria, but also the de facto capital of ISIS. Ignorant politicians named Johnson's are fairly common, but the New York Times should do better than this, I think. Just to look at one of the images that was produced by a Brit. Now, ignorance in the case of Aleppo is not simply not knowing, but as Mohammed Saknini has recently shown in relation to British attitudes to the city, it's a problem of regular and constant forgetting. Saknini argues that rhetoric used during the debates leading up to the 2016 Brexit debates involved not only scaremongering, but what he calls, quote, a sense of historical amnesia regarding Britain's long history of being in the world, particularly the long-standing relationship between Britain and the Middle East that extends beyond the narrow fear of Islam and Muslims. Like Saknini, I wish today to rethink this historical amnesia and to recall what he terms the previous cosmopolitan encounters experienced by Britons travelling and residing in Syria. And I do this with some trepidation, because like Basil, I know there are people out there that know more about this than I do. I think of certain people I know, and there are bound to be other people who know Aleppo certainly better than I do, but that's the breaks. 18th century Britons, he argues, this is Saknini, found in Aleppo a cosmopolitan space where they experienced enlightenment, toleration, sociability, and living in peace, not only with the Catholic, French, and Italian merchants, but also with Muslim and Jewish residents of the city. Now, while Saknini focuses exclusively on 18th century Aleppo, a longer historical survey that I propose today, reaching from the 16th into the 19th, complements and complicates this version of events. Most importantly, the longer historical perspective indicates how these cosmopolitan encounters and the sociability that made them possible were symptoms of what the architectural historian Hegner Wattenpauw has identified as Ottoman adaptability. What Wattenpauw finds characteristic of Ottoman architectural practice, this adaptability, holds true also, I will suggest, for numerous ways in which the British presence in Aleppo influenced the social, material and cultural life of the city. The arrival of the Ottomans in 1516 transformed the ancient city of Aleppo from a regional trading centre into a major international entrepot. Within 50 years of Ottoman rule, the commercial core of the city more than doubled that of Cairo. More than doubled and rivaled that of Cairo. Cairo is still number one. But by the time the Levant Company had established its presence after 1583, new mosques and many other public buildings in the Ottoman style had appeared, altering the skyline and declaring the power of the Ottoman Sultanate. From the imperial centre of Istanbul, Ottoman argues, the leading Ottoman architect, Mimar Sinan, had established a recognisable standard of Ottoman urban style, what she calls a recognisable Ottoman design capable of being replicated efficiently in the provinces, a canon for Ottoman architecture. Now, throughout the 16th century, she goes on to argue, peripheral and provincial imperatives, such as local context, available materials, availability of skilled labour, meant that mosques adopted standardised features, domes and minarets, while subsidiary elements, her phrase, by which she's referring to the bathhouses, the soup kitchens, the schools, the khans and the caravanserais, followed local visual repertoires. In provincial cities such as Aleppo, the centralising stylistic modes of the imperial metropolis were adapted to the practical imperatives and traditional idioms of peripheral regions. Under the Ottomans, the ancient city of Aleppo was rebuilt and reconfigured to create a distinctly Ottoman urban space. However, this process was not, as in Istanbul and Damascus, directed by the Sultan, but through the energies and designs of elite patrons who paid for the new buildings and who established foundations, vakıfs, to pay for their upkeep. The most important among these, as some of you will know, are notably Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, 1506 to 1579, and Mirza Fonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, 1634 to 83, both of whom were products of the Devshirme system and consequently not entitled to own property, unlike the city's established pre-Ottoman ulema or eshraf families, those descended from the Prophet, who monopolized control over existing vakıfs and property ownership in Aleppo. The result was a constantly variable series of compromises that shaped the process of design and construction that modified metropolitan imperial styles by adapting them to fit local circumstances and requirements. So, in Ottoman Aleppo, indigenous and foreign imperatives, backed up by commercial power, were in constant renegotiation with the imperial centre. Ottoman argues that this pattern of adaptability and compromise, characteristic of urban development in the city's built structures, also gave shape and substance to fluctuating social and cultural norms. From the late 16th until the early 19th century, the presence of resident British merchants in Aleppo contributed to key architectural, commercial, cultural and social transformations of the city in specific and demonstrable ways. As historian Abraham Marcus observes, while Aleppo was subject to external influences such as international trade and the vagaries of Ottoman rule, the city was also more exposed to European context than most other places anywhere in the Middle East, most especially the Western consuls and missionaries who cultivated local followings among the local Muslims. Now, the early British merchants to visit Aleppo seem to have been aware only of the importance of commerce and of the many different nations trading there. It was in Aleppo in 1553 that Anthony Jenkinson famously received a special trading license signed by none other than Suleiman the Magnificent. 30 years later, in 1583, merchants of the English Turkey Company, later the Levant Company, formally established their residence there. In May that year, John Newbery, Ralph Fitch and John Eldred passed through Aleppo on their way to India, but only Eldred, in his memoir, took any notice of the city. He observed, "This is the greatest place of traffic for a dry town that is in all these parts. For hither resort Jews, Tartarians, Persians, Armenians, Egyptians, Indians, and many sorts of Christians, and they enjoy freedom of their consciences, and bring thither many kinds of rich merchandises. In the midst of this town also standeth a goodly castle raised on high, and a garrison of 400 or 500 janissaries. Within 4 miles round about are goodly gardens, vineyards, and trees, which bear goodly fruit near unto the riverside. The walls are about 3 English miles in compass, but the suburbs are almost as much more. This town is greatly peopled." Such was the immediate importance of the Aleppo trade to English merchants that within 20 years, Richard Bragg commented that Because it is so well known to all of our nation, I omit to write of it. The Venetian ambassador to Persia, Joseph at Barbero, had said the same thing over a century before. Nevertheless, generations of British visitors to Aleppo would continue to describe the city and its commerce as if they were viewing it for the first time. A year after Rag finds Morrison arrived in late June 1596 and recorded, "The traffic in this place is exceeding great, so as the goods of all Asia and all the eastern lands are brought hither, or to Cairo and Egypt." Morrison also noted how the English merchants lived in 3 great houses, as it were in colleges, where they enjoyed plentiful diet, good lodging, and most friendly conversation. They drink excellent wines, and it was here he reports he was most courteously entertained at no cost to himself. So the luxurious life of the Turkey merchant was starting to take shape in circumstances that were to remain exclusively male, if not masculine, monastical or academic, until well into the 18th century. By the end of the 17th, British travellers and residents had settled on a number of set topics when writing about Aleppo. These would recur for the next 2 centuries. The centrality of internal and international commerce, catalogues of many foreign nations, contrasts with Damascus or Cairo, descriptions of the stone building, remarks on religious freedom, diversity of faith, language and culture, observations on the pleasures of companionship in this exclusively masculine world, with regular comparisons to life in an academic college, comments on the opportunities for touristic excursions and social life among the European community, accounts of local food and drink, and opinions on whether or not to adopt local costume. In other words, most British writers either focused on describing how the city living there differed from life in Britain, or how it offered unexpected pleasures and opportunities unavailable at home. And, with a very few notable exceptions, for over 200 years they seemed blithely unaware that others had said these things before them. What most were less prone to comment on, or in some cases even to notice, was how their very presence in the city was an important influence on its architectural, social and cultural development. Nevertheless, there is ample evidence of how modifications to the built structures in which the British lived and worked enabled forms of sociability that would otherwise not have developed among the indigenous inhabitants. Writing in the 18th century, Patrick Russell observed how, from their first establishment, Europeans in Aleppo lodged in some of the principal khans within the Medina Souk, a gated and partially covered market area situated within the walled city centre. The earliest British merchants to arrive took up residence in the Khan al-Gumruk, while the first consuls lived in the adjacent Khan al-Gurgul. Constructed by Sokol Mehmed Pasha starting in 1574, these 2-storey rectilinear structures were conventionally built around a central courtyard or piazza and were modified by their expatriate inhabitants. This is Sauvager, the French historian's map of the souk, which indicates how they were. Part of the point being that the whole layout of the souk and the city centre under the Ottomans followed plans for the way Ottomans liked to do business. I'm not an urban historian or an architectural historian, I'm relying on people who are to make that statement. Correct me if it's wrong. There's the entrance to the Khan al-Gurgul where the consuls lived, and the approach to the Khan al-Gumruk taken before the recent bombings. A very early one of the entrance. There it is again before. This is pretty much how when I first visited in 2003, things looked. A lot of imported stuff from Pakistan. And here it is just after the war. Now in 1632, court records show how the English were expanding their presence in the city as they carried out a renovation in the Khan al-Kharatin. I haven't found pictures of that. Russell explained how the original Ottoman buildings were adapted by the British residents to provide the closed private spaces upstairs where dinner and drinking parties could be discreetly held. Quote, the piazza being walled up, large windows in European fashion were made towards the court. The floors are neatly paved with stone or marble, and the apartments enlarged and handsomely fitted. The warehouses are all on the ground floor. It would have been in such an apartment that, on 4 May 1676, Henry Tong and 12 Englishmen more enjoyed entertainment for princes, thanks to the merchant Mr. Trench. Although the Hans were initially designed by city authorities, or assigned by the city authorities to the various nations, the number of resident merchants grew such that eventually European merchants were also free to rent houses. And these, having flat roofs, were subject to further innovation. Again, Russell explains. The Franks who lived contiguous had doors of communication, and by means of their own and the bizarre terraces, they can make a large circuit without ever descending into the street, an agreeable convenience in time of the plague. But he continues, the natives have no intercourse by these terraces. Thus, in Vottenpauw's words, the British and other Europeans transformed and inhabited the city according to their own practices of space, with the result that within the soup, the central corridors dividing the Hans became an exceptional urban space, extraterrestrial to the rest of the city, a space of uncommon openness, a place of encounter. Now the point of contrast was to the suburban neighbourhoods outside the city walls, where the local Christian, Jewish, Muslim and Kurdish communities lived and mixed among themselves, but seldom had any dealings with European merchants beyond the requirements of trade. Saknini, in his article on 18th century Aleppo, celebrates this space of uncommon openness to mark out 18th century Aleppo as a cosmopolitan city, where, quote, Europeans were free to mix among themselves and pursue their European habits with no Muslim intervention in their affairs. But life was not always so equable, especially in the early years when the English first arrived. Passing through Aleppo in 1599, George Mannering reports how, walking on the street one day, he was seized by the ear by a Turk, a gallant man he seemed to be by his habit, and paraded through the city for the space of 1 hour, with much company following me, many spitting on me. So at the last he let me go, and because I would not laugh at my departure from him, he gave me such a blow with the staff that it struck me to the ground. Returning to the consul's house, Mannering describes how the consul's janissary, seeing me all bloody, asked me how I came hurt. On being told, the janissary sought out the culprit and proceeded to bastinado him, so he was not able to go or stand. Mannering may well have wandered too far from the Spatial city, where the Europeans lived and traded in relative safety, but here, even here, problems could arise in those early years. In 1603, William Biddulph records how one William Martin, while sleeping on the terrace, that is, the top of the house, because it was so hot, had his throat cut by robbers who had climbed up a ladder. The unfortunate Martin happened to be sleeping on the roof of a house rented by James Staper, the younger brother of Richard Staper, one of the great London merchants of the time, and charter member of the Levant and the East India Company. Eventually, the inner city where Europeans lived was gated and the streets were patrolled at night. Nevertheless, Patrick Russell, writing in 1794 about an aversion to, recalled in 1794 how an aversion to the Franks as enemies of the true believers is certainly not imaginary. It inspired women and children to sing insulting songs whenever a European passes by. As late as 1805, Julius Griffiths reports how Europeans were commonly insulted on the streets of Aleppo. In general, however, so long as the activities of the British and the other European residents remained private and out of the public domain, they were generally tolerated or ignored. But conspicuous innovation could be a different matter. Certainly not everyone was happy about the increasing population of the infidels, and not all their public activities were deemed acceptable. As early as the 16th century, the historian Ibn al-Hanbali lamented that nowadays the Franks live in various areas of the city, whereas in prior times they lived only in a few Hans, where their activities remained private. Over a century later, Isles Irwin reports how an English merchant of Aleppo brought a wheeled carriage from London and drove it one day on the roads, but unluckily meeting with the Pasha and his suite, their horses took fright at the noise of the wheels and galloped into the city, when an order was immediately issued for the suppression of any such nuisances. Not all British innovations were considered objectionable, however. On the death of the first English consul, William, or perhaps John, we don't actually know his name, Barrett, in 1584, one of the oldest dated Protestant cemeteries in the world was established that year in the grounds of the Christian cemetery in the Aziza district. Although the British residents were by no means the first to encourage the production and consumption of wine, they were, by their own account at least, responsible for the importation of beef and sea fish. Henry Tong observed that of late, some beef was being brought only to the English in Aleppo. Patrick Russell noted that sea fish is rarely brought to town except for the Europeans, while William George Brown, who visited in the summer of 1797, commented that meat is very good and in plenty, but there are no fish save a few small eels, though wine is very dear, none being produced in the neighbourhood. Abraham Parsons, consul in Iskenderun from 1767 until 1772, described the trade in beef and cod and how they were exchanged between the British communities of Aleppo and Iskenderun. We often salt and send codfish to our friends at Aleppo, and they in return send by the messenger a fine piece of salted beef. On such occasions the messenger carries from 30 to 40 pounds weight and obliges himself to go to Aleppo in 48 hours from the time he leaves Skanderun and to return in the same period. His pay is 4 piastres, or 10 shillings English, for the whole journey, besides which he gets a present of a piastre at Aleppo and another at his return, as long as he complies with his assignment. Parsons continued by noting how, in addition to cod, red and grey mullet, John Dory and sole were seasonably available in Iskenderun and sometimes sent. During the course of the 18th century, the Levant Company merchants increasingly found it difficult to make profits in Aleppo for a number of reasons. Nevertheless, even while commerce started to fall off, the British presence continued to contribute to the city's social and cultural development. That should be hunted, right. On 30th of November 1747, Alexander Drummond founded the Union Lodge from Drummond Kilwinning from Greenock in Aleppo, the first chartered Masonic lodge outside of his native Scotland. Among the founding members was a fellow Scot, Patrick Russell, who at the time was serving as surgeon aboard the Delaware, which regularly called into Iskenderun, giving him opportunity to visit his older brother Alexander Russell, the Levant Company physician in Aleppo. In 1751, Drummond would be appointed consul in Aleppo, but it was a later consul, John Barker, who single-handedly introduced medical, industrial and agricultural changes. In 1803, Barker inoculated his own children against smallpox. The practice was quickly adopted by local Christian and Jewish families, though not by the Muslims. In 1820, Barker set about improving the local silk industry by importing the best silkworm eggs to be procured from France, and every subsequent year he received fresh seed eggs from France and Italy, which he had brought up in his wife's silk mulberry plantations at Suadia, today's Samandala. Visiting in 1848, Frederick Neal reckoned that, as a result of Barker's importations, Aleppo silk was, quote, now the finest in any part of the East. Barker also introduced a number of previously unknown fruits and vegetables: potatoes, tomatoes, loquat, plum, greengage, Chinese quince, mandarin orange, sweet kernel apricots, peaches, as well as many shrubs and flowers. Evidently, by the later 18th century, the male-only community of British expatriates in Aleppo had become a thing of the past. Although John Barker was not the first Englishman in Aleppo to have been accompanied by an English wife, the practice seems to have been very recent. Giles Irwin recalled being entertained in March 1781 by the consul and his wife, and there he met Mr. Hayes and his agreeable lady. This would have been Consul John Thomas Abbott, David Hayes and his wife Louisa, née Vernon, who, on David's death in 1784, married Robert Page Abbott, who had been serving as factor for the Levant Company since John Thomas Abbott's death in 83. In June 1800, John Barker married Marianne Hayes, Louisa's daughter with David, having arrived in Aleppo in May 1799. However, writing in 1794, Patrick Russell observed that female society is very confined and claimed, curiously, none of the English are married. But he added a provocatively vague footnote asserting that circumstances are much altered in this respect since 1752, the female society of Aleppo having had an agreeable accession of several married ladies from Europe. Of these European ladies, Russell tells us no more, though he does observe how in former times French subjects of an inferior rank find their way into the Levant and intermarry with the native Christians, producing a half-French race, or Metza Raza. Although not many years ago a royal edict was issued recalling all such Frenchmen, several families still remain in Aleppo, of which some are visited by the Europeans, and the ladies are an agreeable accession to the public assemblies. We also learn from Henry Abbott, the nephew of Robert Abbott, who grew up in Aleppo, that an Italian physician had his family with him. Young Henry learned Italian from his 3 daughters, and together they frequently got up plays from Goldini, which we exhibited upon a neat little theatre he had built us for the purpose. Visiting Aleppo in the 1770s, James Capper confirmed the Europeans had built a small theatre where they performed French and Italian comedies. Although British trade had dwindled, in 1820, John Fuller reckoned Aleppo was by far the most cheerful place in Syria, in part because of the remarkable hospitality of the Jewish community, from whom, he writes, I received very great civility and attention throughout my stay. Frequently went to their houses, especially on the day of their Sabbath, when they received visits of ceremony. On these occasions, the ladies of the family, some of whom are very pretty, made their appearance in their best dresses. So, Aleppo's characteristic culture of sociability, described by Sacnini, clearly extended to the Jewish community in ways unimaginable in parts of Europe at the time. Ottoman Aleppo was open to such cosmopolitan encounters, and if the British were not foremost in promoting theatrical entertainment, they'd long been leaders in organising sport. By the time Henry Tong arrived in 1676, the English custom of riding out of town to camp by the side of the river Kwai was well established. Tong describes how a princely tent would be pitched, and we had several pastimes and sports, such as duck hunting, fishing, shooting, handball, cricket, scrofilo. This is the only instance of that word in the OED. If anyone knows what scrofilo is, it's some sort of game, presumably, but the OED cites it but doesn't know what it is. And then a noble dinner would be brought thither with great plenty of all sorts of wines, punch and lemonades. A century later, Russell recounts how the English gentlemen keep excellent horses and usually take an airing on them every day. Throughout the winter months from November to March, they ride out into the country twice a week and go hawking and hunting, while the other Europeans use in general less exercise. Setting up camp by the river, playing cricket, hunting hare and gazelles with greyhounds, shooting duck, partridge, woodcock and snipe, the British residents continued to enjoy such activities throughout the 18th century, even as their numbers declined with the fall-off of trade. By the turn into the 19th century, however, trade had shifted to Izmir and Istanbul, and the British merchants were withdrawing from Aleppo. By 1824, Consul John Barker was the only Englishman living in the city. The following year, the Levant Company was dissolved, and British trade passed to Crown authority. When Francis Newman arrived in January 1831, he discovered there are no English residents here at present. Mr. Barker, formerly consul, is now at Alexandria. And greatly to his dismay, there is only one Protestant beside ourselves in the city, and he a Swiss watchmaker. A few years later, in 1848, Frederick Neal unearthed 2 English merchants residing in Aleppo, though he also reported the British trade was being handled entirely by Greek agents. So, after more than 2.5 centuries of British influence on the city coming to an end, with the disappearance of the expatriate merchants, leaving behind only some minor modifications to the buildings in which they lived and conducted business, and the Protestant cemetery as monuments to their presence, the British in Aleppo, more or less, the story I'm telling anyway, came to an end. Thank you very much for your presence.
Well, thank you very much, Gerald. Full of new information, and hopefully it'll be published soon.
We'll see. We'll see.
Really wonderful. And
thank you.
Questions can come at the end.
Yes.